Are you tired of using your camera's automatic settings and getting photos that just don't turn out the way that you want them to? Well, it's time to take control and start using your camera in one of the manual modes. In this video, I'm going to give you a beginner's guide to start taking your photos to the next level. When you start photographing in manual mode, you're going to have three settings that you're going to have to work with. Three primary settings. That's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Boiled down to its most simplistic elements, aperture controls how much light is actually getting inside the camera. Shutter speed determines how long the sensor is exposed to that light. And ISO is how sensitive that sensor is to light. A careful balance of those three settings is what gives you a proper photo. But how do you know if a photo is too light or too dark exactly? Well, there's actually a couple different ways to go about that. One of them is that every camera has a type of light meter built inside of it. And the light meter will display how bright or how dark your image is in relation to the settings that you have on those three settings. Another way to check exposure is to use something called a histogram. A histogram is a bar graph that you can bring up through your camera's menu system. It's not on by default, and it is a very accurate way to tell if you're exposed properly. It's a little more advanced method, but down the line you can do some research on it and see if it works for you. And the last way, that's also the easiest way, is to just take test photos. Take a shot, look at it, and see how it turns out. This isn't the best way because of how slow and tedious it is, but that's okay for right now because you're learning. And as you start to get more comfortable with your camera and all these different settings and modes, you'll start to get faster and improve yourself and learn new techniques. Okay, jumping right into it, we're gonna start with aperture. Aperture is a physical aperture inside your lens. It works exactly the same way as the iris does in your eye, getting smaller and larger. This size of that opening is measured in something called an f-stop. You'll see that represented as the letter F / a number. Sometimes it's a decimal number like 2.2 or 2.8. The thing to remember about aperture is that the smaller the F number, the larger the hole. The larger the F number, the smaller the hole. And then consequently, smaller hole, less light, larger hole, more light. This also affects how much is in focus. How much blurry background are you gonna have? A smaller f-stop number, like 1.8, is gonna give you a very blurry background. That's a larger hole, but a smaller number, blurrier background. And the opposite's true for a smaller hole. Next, we're gonna talk about shutter speed. The shutter is a physical mechanical curtain inside your camera that opens and closes for a specific amount of time, exposing the image sensor to give your picture. In some newer cameras, this shutter is emulated digitally and it is not there physically. Both a physical shutter and a digital shutter, also known as an electronic shutter, they have their pros and cons, but they both follow the same rules. The speed at which that curtain opens and closes is measured in fractions of a second. You would see it represented like 1/10, 1/10, 1/100th, 1/200th. And like a fraction, smaller the fraction, the less time that the image sensor is exposed to the light. So 1/100th is slower than 1/200th. Faster shutter speeds like 1/200th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, things like that are good for sports or anything moving very fast, while slower shutter speeds are good for low light situations or really creative photography. Shutter speed is one of my favorite settings to use because it can open a whole bunch of doors when it comes to your creative process. All right, last we're going to be talking about ISO. ISO is a rather abstract setting in that it's not measuring anything specific. It is telling your camera how sensitive it needs to be to light in order to get you a photo. And ISO is a standardized setting between all cameras within a tolerance. So one ISO setting should be approximately the same sensitivity as the ISO setting on a different camera. And like I said before, ISO is dictating how sensitive your sensor is to light and how much light it needs to give you a photo. It is measured by a series of numbers, ISO 50, 100, 150, 200, and sometimes you'll see third stop options too, but basically what you need to know is that smaller the number, 50 for example, the camera is less sensitive to light, thus it needs more light to give you a picture. The higher the ISO number, let's say 1600, it is less sensitive, so it doesn't need as much light to actually give you a photo. Something you have to watch out for when you're using ISO is how clean or how grainy your image will be. When you're using higher ISO numbers, like 2000, 3000 or higher, you will notice that things are going to look muddy or grainy, and that is a direct result of your ISO. If you want less noise grain, you have to use a smaller ISO. And there you have it. Those 3 settings are what you primarily use to get a proper exposure with your camera in manual mode. This is also known as the exposure triangle. Keep in mind, each setting affects the other. When you change one, you will have to change the other 2. And each setting will have its own set of effects. Shutter speed controls the motion blur and how fast a picture is taken, but also decreases or increases how much light's getting in. Aperture controls how much is in focus, how much of a blurry background you have, but is another bottleneck of how much light is getting inside your camera. ISO kind of fills in the gap, dictating how much light you need for a photo, but you might get really grainy images if you use a setting too high. Gotta use all 3 of those settings to get the photo that you want. And there'll be moments where you'll have to compromise and prioritize one setting over the other. Congratulations, you now know the basics of manual photography and getting the exposure the way you want. If you start practicing with these tools, you will soon notice that the days of your images being too bright or too dark are gone. You'll be able to confidently take a picture and get a proper exposure every time. Of course, this is just the beginning. Those 3 settings we mentioned, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, get more in depth. We just scratched the surface on this stuff. And we could make whole separate videos on each one of those things. Give this video a like if you learned something new today, leave a comment below if this helped you, or if you have an additional question you want me to expand on, and share this to your friends and family who might want to learn more about their cameras. That's all I got for you today. Happy shooting.